For as long as anyone could remember, humanity had been known across the stars as the Death. The name itself carried a mix of fear and awe, whispered in the halls of interstellar councils and among species that had never even set foot on a human-inhabited planet. Humans had earned this reputation not because they sought war or conquest, but because their homeworld Terra was unlike any other. It was a planet that challenged its inhabitants at every turn. From blistering deserts to frozen wastelands, from toxic swamps to mountains that scraped the clouds, life on Earth demanded strength, cunning, and resilience. Every disease, every predator, every natural disaster shaped the people who survived there. Only the strong, clever, and adaptable could thrive, and over centuries, this created a species unlike any other in the galaxy. Humans who were tougher, smarter, and far more resourceful than almost any alien civilization they encountered. The environment alone wasn't the only thing that molded humanity. Their history was a long record of hardship and perseverance. Wars, famines, and plagues had struck humanity repeatedly. Entire cities had been destroyed, and whole generations had struggled to survive against enemies both natural and man-made. Unlike other civilizations in the galaxy, humans had learned to rely on their instincts, intelligence, and innovation to overcome obstacles rather than waiting for intervention from external forces. This resilience became embedded in their very nature. A human could walk into a world where everything was hostile and not just survive, but thrive. They were practical, quick-thinking, and capable of solving problems in ways that other species often considered impossible. Human technology reflected their unique evolution. Unlike empires that focused on flashy weapons or overwhelming numbers, humanity focused on adaptability. Their ships were built to withstand the harshest conditions, their weapons engineered for maximum efficiency, and their strategies designed to anticipate the unexpected. Even when they appeared outnumbered, humans could turn the tide of a battle because their planning accounted for every possible contingency. Alien observers often remarked that humans seemed to anticipate threats before they even existed, reacting with speed and precision that made them unpredictable in every sense. Despite all this, humans were not aggressive conquerors. Most species assumed that a civilization capable of surviving on a planet like Terra would naturally be dangerous and expansionist. Yet humans usually kept to themselves. They valued their independence and preferred to intervene only when absolutely necessary. Other species would occasionally try to provoke them or test their patience, and history showed that such attempts almost always ended in disaster for the challengers. Over time, this selective involvement shaped a reputation that combined fear with grudging respect. Across the galaxy, humans were known as the guardians who could be counted on in emergencies, but only if the cause was just and the stakes were real. Meanwhile, a small, gentle species known as the Terran lived far from human space. The Terran were peaceful by nature, herbivorous in diet, and physically weak compared to many of the aggressive empires around them. They relied on diplomacy, treaties, and careful negotiation to survive, and their society had developed complex protocols to avoid conflict. For generations, the Terran had managed to maintain their autonomy despite threats from more powerful neighbors. Their home worlds were lush and beautiful, but their people lacked the physical resilience or combat instincts of the humans or other Deathworlder species. To survive, the Terran had learned to appeal to morality, reputation, and interstellar law rather than strength. Their leaders became skilled manipulators of perception, experts at using words and appearances to sway others to their side. As interstellar tensions grew, the Terran found themselves cornered. A powerful neighboring empire, known for its ruthlessness, began pressing into their territory, claiming borders that had been disputed for centuries. The Terran were desperate. They feared that if the conflict escalated, their people could be wiped out. In their view, diplomacy alone might not be enough. They began exploring options that could help them survive, looking for allies who might intervene on their behalf. It was during this critical period that they turned their eyes to humanity. Across the galaxy, humans were respected for their fairness and feared for their ability to enforce it. If the Terran could convince the humans to step in, they might survive the encroaching empire's aggression. The Terran sent out their distress signals with great care, framing themselves as helpless victims in urgent need of aid. They described their situation in emotional terms, highlighting threats to civilians and their inability to defend themselves. Every message was carefully crafted to elicit sympathy and provoke action from any advanced species that might respond. Among these, humans received the call and took note immediately. Their intelligence networks, always monitoring distress signals and political movements, analyzed the Terran's plea. Humans had long known that the galaxy was filled with conflict, manipulation, and deceit. They had seen species use false distress calls to lure allies into traps, and they approached every situation with caution. Yet even the most experienced human analysts could not ignore the urgency of the Terran's message. It was a delicate balance. Act too quickly and risk being manipulated. Act too slowly and innocent lives might be lost. The human response was measured but decisive. Instead of immediately sending a massive fleet, they dispatched a small diplomatic team to assess the situation. This team consisted of highly trained negotiators, intelligence officers, and security specialists. chosen for their ability to discern truth from deception. The humans approached the Terran world carefully, prepared for both diplomacy and potential conflict. Upon arrival, they were greeted by what appeared to be a population on the brink of disaster. The Terran presented vivid accounts of attacks, destroyed villages, and desperate pleas for intervention. Human sensors detected heightened emotions, recorded communications with repeated cries for help, and even artificial damage simulations designed to dramatize the situation. To an outsider, it seemed as though the Terran were in genuine peril, relying on the humans as the last hope for their survival. But humanity's instincts were different from other species. While some would have accepted appearances at face value, humans relied on observation, logic, and a deep understanding of behavior. They began to notice small inconsistencies. Certain records did not match sensor data. Reports of attacks came at suspicious intervals, often coinciding with times when independent observers were absent. The Terrans' behavior showed signs of coordination beyond what their distressed population should have been capable of. Despite the outward display of desperation, the humans remained calm, collecting evidence and analyzing every detail. They were trained to detect deception, and while nothing was conclusive yet, patterns were starting to emerge that hinted at manipulation. At the same time, humans maintained their principle of cautious intervention. They were willing to help, but only if the threat was real. This balance between skepticism and readiness was a hallmark of human diplomacy. It allowed them to respond quickly in genuine crises while minimizing the risk of being drawn into conflicts based on lies. The team's initial approach was slow, deliberate, and highly methodical, reflecting a species that had learned from millennia of surviving against both environmental and political threats. They moved carefully, observing, questioning, and preparing contingencies for every possible scenario. The humans also began communicating with other galactic powers to cross-check the Terran story. Intelligence from neighboring systems, diplomatic channels, and even intercepted messages from potentially hostile empires were analyzed. All of this combined gave the humans a broader perspective. They could see how the Terrans' account fit or didn't fit into the larger picture. The process was time-consuming but necessary. In the galaxy, actions taken based on false information could lead to disastrous wars, destruction, or even species-level consequences. Humans understood this more than most. Their history had been forged in survival against impossible odds, and they approached interstellar politics with the same careful strategy that had kept them alive on their harsh home world. Despite the caution, humans were prepared to act. They had the capability to mobilize a fleet at a moment's notice, to protect the Terran if the threat was real, or to enforce consequences if the Terran had lied. Their presence alone carried weight. The Terran, who believed themselves to be clever manipulators, did not fully comprehend the extent of humanity's power, experience, or instincts. The humans observed, waited, and prepared, knowing that the situation could escalate at any moment. Their unique combination of caution, intelligence, and overwhelming capability made them a force unlike any other in the galaxy, an unpredictable yet reliable presence that could tip the balance of any interstellar conflict. And so, the stage was set. The humans arrived, the Terran presented their plea, and the galaxy watched. On the surface, it seemed like a simple story of potential aid and diplomacy. Beneath the surface, it was the beginning of a complex tale that would test humanity's judgment, resilience, and understanding of truth. Even before any real conflict had begun, the seeds of tension, deception, and revelation had been planted. Humanity, the Deathworlders, stood ready not just as potential saviors, but as judges, observers, and enforcers of a truth that few other species could fully comprehend. In those early moments, that humans understood something fundamental about the galaxy. Appearances could be deceiving, desperation could be weaponized, and even the most delicate pleas for help could conceal motives far darker than anyone expected. This understanding, forged from centuries of survival and experience, would guide every decision they made in the days to come. It was the calm before the storm, the quiet observation that precedes action, and the first step in a story that would ripple across the stars for generations. Humanity was watching, learning, and preparing, ready to respond in a way only the Deathworlders could. After receiving the Terran's distress signal, humanity approached the situation with both curiosity and caution. The message painted a picture of urgency and desperation. The Terran claimed that their cities were under attack, that innocent civilians were being slaughtered, and that they had no way to defend themselves. At first glance, the transmission seemed genuine. The emotion, the fear, the repeated pleas for help, all of it appeared authentic. And to any casual observer, the Terran were clearly on the brink of disaster. But humans were far from casual observers. Their intelligence networks stretched across countless star systems, continuously monitoring communications, movements, and subtle anomalies. A signal this carefully crafted rarely escaped their scrutiny. The humans began by analyzing the distress call in minute detail. They traced its origin, examined its content for inconsistencies, and cross-referenced it with known data about the region. What they found was intriguing. The signal originated from the Terran home system, but certain timestamps did not match recorded planetary activity. The distress seemed urgent, yet at the same time, certain environmental sensors indicated no immediate danger. It was a contradiction that made the humans pause and consider the possibility that this might not be as straightforward as it appeared. The Human Alliance, despite its caution, was not willing to ignore a potential humanitarian crisis. They knew the galaxy was filled with complex political dynamics, but they had also made a long-standing principle of helping those in true need. A decision was made to dispatch a small diplomatic fleet, designed for evaluation rather than intervention. The fleet included negotiators, security personnel, analysts, and experts in alien behavior. These were not just diplomats, they were humans trained to see beyond surface appearances, trained to detect lies, manipulation, and subtle signals of hidden intentions. As the fleet approached the Terran system, the crew prepared for a delicate balancing act. They needed to confirm the veracity of the Terrans' claims while being ready to act immediately if the situation was genuine. They could not rely solely on the emotional appeal of the Terran. Evidence and observation were critical. Upon entering Terran space, the humans encountered a world that matched the distress narrative in appearance. Cities showed signs of hurried activity, certain districts had visible damage, and there was a palpable sense of fear among the population. Civilians appeared nervous, leaders spoke in hushed tones, and the Terran presented detailed accounts of previous attacks. Every aspect seemed designed to support the story of urgent danger. Initially, the human team allowed themselves a measured sense of empathy. They were not unfeeling. Their history had shown that many species truly did face overwhelming threats. But at the same time, they observed the Terrans' behavior with a critical eye. Small details began to stand out. Certain public announcements were carefully scripted and repeated verbatim, which suggested rehearsed statements rather than spontaneous panic. Emergency broadcasts were timed in a way that coordinated perfectly with the arrival of human vessels, raising the possibility that the distress was staged to influence human perception. The humans were trained to notice such patterns, and this began to plant seeds of doubt. The Terran leadership was keenly aware of the humans' reputation. They understood that humans were powerful and that their involvement could drastically alter the balance of power in the region. They had studied human responses to crises for years, knowing that humans valued fairness, evidence, and moral responsibility. With this knowledge, they went to great lengths to manipulate appearances. They staged attacks, showcased injured civilians, and provided carefully constructed evidence of danger. They expected that the humans would act swiftly, as they had in other situations in the past. To the Terran, this was a calculated risk. If successful, they would gain powerful allies who would enforce their interests. If discovered, they risked humiliation and potential retaliation. It was a gamble, and they were confident in their preparation. But the humans were not ordinary allies. Unlike other species that relied on surface-level impressions, humans relied on observation, interrogation, and technology to uncover the truth. The Terrans' elaborate staging was impressive, but humans noticed irregularities that others might have missed. As the human team conducted their investigation, they began to engage with local Terran officials and citizens. Interviews were held, data logs examined, and patrol routes observed. Humans noticed patterns that were difficult to reconcile with the narrative of helpless victims. Some districts claimed to have been attacked but showed no real structural damage. Civilians described attacks with exact timing and details that seemed rehearsed, as if they were participating in a coordinated performance rather than reporting their own experiences. Yet, there were genuine signs of fear, albeit subtle, that suggested some members of the Terran population may not have been complicit in the deception. Humans had learned to distinguish between orchestrated behavior by leadership and the natural responses of ordinary citizens, and they carefully recorded these distinctions. They were gathering evidence, preparing for both eventualities, that the Terran were in danger or that they were attempting to manipulate the humans. Meanwhile, intelligence gathered from neighboring systems revealed conflicting reports. Some systems indicated that there had been minor skirmishes, border disputes, or territorial movements, but none matched the scale of the disaster described by the Terran. Ships that the Terran claimed had been destroyed were accounted for in other reports, sometimes active in nearby trade lanes or military exercises. These discrepancies heightened the human suspicion. While the Terran narrative was emotionally compelling, the humans' cross-checking revealed contradictions that could not be ignored. The fleet had arrived expecting to mediate or protect, but now they were also investigators, uncovering evidence that suggested deception. Every day brought new observations. Every interaction with the Terran officials revealed more inconsistencies. Despite this, humans remained outwardly composed, knowing that premature confrontation could escalate the situation unnecessarily. The humans also monitored Terran communications extensively. Private channels, coded messages, and civilian networks were analyzed for signs of coordination. What emerged was a subtle pattern of manipulation. Terran leaders were using controlled fear and urgency to create pressure on the human fleet. They believed that humans would act hastily to prevent civilian casualties, thereby falling into a trap designed to shift the balance of power in their favor. The humans, however, detected these signals and interpreted them with caution. They understood that the Terran were attempting psychological manipulation, and they prepared strategies to counter it without endangering innocent citizens. The analysis of these communications became a critical component of the human approach, allowing them to separate performance from reality. Throughout this process, the humans remained careful not to alienate the population. They treated ordinary Terran with respect, offered reassurance, and observed social behavior to determine who was genuine and who was orchestrating the deception. By blending empathy with scrutiny, humans maintained both ethical standards and investigative rigor. They were not just evaluating the situation, they were also building a foundation of credibility and influence that would allow them to act decisively if deception was confirmed. This approach reflected humanity's deep understanding of interstellar politics. Influence and persuasion often outweighed brute force, and careful observation often revealed truths that others overlooked. After several days of careful monitoring, humans began compiling a comprehensive picture. The outward signs of catastrophe, the emotional displays, and the urgent appeals began to be contrasted with subtle evidence of manipulation. Logs that had been altered, public statements that were rehearsed, and environmental data that contradicted claims all suggested that the situation was not entirely as it appeared. The human team faced a critical question. Should they intervene immediately based on the apparent urgency, or should they continue to investigate and risk being drawn into a political trap? The answer was clear to them, as it had been in similar situations throughout human history: act with caution, prepare for intervention, but gather sufficient evidence to ensure that any action was justified and precise. That humans had established multiple layers of understanding. They recognized that the Terran were desperate and capable of complex deception, that there were genuine risks in the region even if exaggerated, and that any intervention would require careful calibration. They had mapped the terrain, identified key personnel, and established communication networks that would allow them to respond swiftly when necessary. Humans, true to their reputation, were ready for multiple scenarios. They could act as protectors, enforcers, or investigators. The galaxy watched, often unaware of the subtle dynamics unfolding. What appeared on the surface to be a simple plea for help was, in reality, a complex situation that demanded the full attention, intelligence, and strategic thinking of humanity. Though calm compared to what was to come, set the tone for the entire operation. It demonstrated humanity's approach to crisis: observe carefully, analyze thoroughly, and act decisively when the truth became clear. The Terran, believing themselves to be clever and manipulative, underestimated the human's ability to see through appearances, anticipate deception, and maintain moral and strategic clarity. Even in this early situation, the seeds of a larger confrontation were being sown. The humans were not merely visitors or passive responders, they were the architects of how the unfolding drama would ultimately resolve. And in this delicate balance between observation, empathy, and readiness, the humans prepared for the next stage, fully aware that the story they were witnessing might reveal truths far more extraordinary than even the Terran's desperate pleas suggested. As the human fleet continued its careful observation of the Terran system, subtle tensions began to emerge, growing like a storm on the horizon. At first, these tensions were almost imperceptible: small inconsistencies in the Terran leaders' statements, unexplained gaps in reported attacks, and strange patterns in civilian behavior. The humans, trained to notice such details, began to recognize a pattern that suggested something far more complicated than a simple plea for help. The Terran, it seemed, were not merely victims of circumstance. They were actively shaping the narrative to influence human actions, trying to manipulate one of the most powerful and unpredictable species in the galaxy. What had started as a straightforward investigation now became a delicate balance of diplomacy, caution, and suspicion. Humans realized that every decision they made could have far-reaching consequences, not just for the Terran or their neighboring enemies, but for the broader political dynamics of the galaxy. The Terran leadership, for their part, were growing anxious. Their initial confidence in humanity's predictable responses had begun to waver. They had expected immediate support, relying on humans' historical reputation for intervening in crises. Instead, the humans were slow, deliberate, and careful, asking questions and collecting data rather than rushing to action. Every inquiry by the humans forced the Terran leaders to improvise, adjust their stories, and maintain the facade of urgency. This created pressure within the Terran government, as officials debated how far they could push the humans without revealing their deception. Some advocated for doubling down on the ruse, staging more dramatic attacks and fabricating evidence to force intervention. Others argued for a more cautious approach, fearing that humans might detect the inconsistencies and turn against them. Within this tension, cracks began to appear in the Terran strategy, and the humans observed these cracks with a careful, calculating interest. Meanwhile, the human team expanded its efforts to understand the situation from multiple angles. They monitored communication channels not only within Terran society but also between Terran and their supposed enemies. These intercepted messages revealed more discrepancies. The Terran were coordinating certain attacks with precision timing, ensuring that human observers would witness them in the most dramatic way possible. Logs of previous skirmishes were altered or selectively deleted, creating gaps that seemed deliberate. Even the environmental simulations of destruction damaged buildings, smoke, and emergency alarms were carefully staged to impress the human observers. Each of these manipulations was clever, but the humans were equally clever in their analysis. They recognized patterns that pointed to a central truth. The Terran were attempting to weaponize human compassion and reputation to achieve political and territorial gains. It was a game of perception and manipulation, and humanity had entered as both the player and the referee as the tension increased. The humans also began interacting directly with Terran civilians. These encounters revealed a stark contrast between ordinary citizens and their leaders. Many Terran appeared genuinely fearful, unaware of the full extent of their leaders' manipulation. They described minor conflicts and localized incidents with sincerity, yet these were often co-opted into the larger narrative of catastrophic danger by government officials. Humans noted these differences carefully, understanding that the true picture of the society's condition was more nuanced than any official report could convey. Civilians were being used as pawns in a broader strategy, and humans recognized the ethical implications. They were prepared to act decisively, but only once the truth was established and innocent lives were considered. Meanwhile, reports from nearby systems complicated the narrative even further. Some independent observers, merchants, and smaller military patrols reported seeing normal activity where the Terran claimed devastation. Ships that were supposedly destroyed were operating as usual. Trade routes remained functional, and certain regions of the Terran system showed no evidence of the large-scale attacks described in official statements. These contradictions created a growing tension within the human team. They realized that the Terran were not just exaggerating, they were actively fabricating scenarios to provoke a response. But the humans also understood that the situation was delicate. Even if the Terran were manipulating them, there were still real risks in the region. The neighboring empire, known for its aggression, could take advantage of any misstep. Humans had to maintain a balance between investigation, diplomacy, and readiness to intervene in a real conflict. Tensions escalated further when a series of coordinated events took place. The Terran leadership staged what appeared to be an attack on a small district, timing it to coincide with a public briefing for the human observers. Explosions, alarms, and simulated casualties created a scene of urgency, designed to elicit an immediate human response. Civilians were instructed to scream, run, and plead for help, all while security forces controlled the environment to maintain the illusion. To an untrained eye, the attack would have seemed real, but the humans quickly detected the inconsistencies. Sensor readings did not match reported damages. Emergency protocols were executed with robotic precision, and escape routes were unobstructed in ways that suggested The humans remained composed, documenting everything and preparing contingency plans in case the deception escalated further. They understood that reacting impulsively could play directly into the Terran strategy, potentially creating a crisis where none truly existed simultaneously. The humans began to communicate with the supposed aggressor empire. Messages were sent, decoded, and analyzed for truth. The neighboring empire denied responsibility for large-scale attacks, stating that Terran claims were exaggerated and politically motivated. They provided data logs, ship tracking reports, and other evidence to contradict Terran statements. This information, combined with the humans' own observations, further highlighted the inconsistencies in the Terran narrative. The human team realized they were dealing with a sophisticated manipulation campaign, one designed to leverage the humans' moral code and reputation for fairness. The Terran had underestimated the humans' ability to detect deception across multiple layers of evidence and coordination. That as the rising conflict progressed, the humans also began monitoring internal Terran discussions. Leaked communications, private logs, and intercepted strategy sessions revealed that some leaders were aware of the risk of exposure but felt trapped by their own deception. They argued about how far they could push the humans without triggering retaliation. Some advocated for more dramatic scenarios, hoping to force human intervention, while others warned that the humans were too intelligent and too cautious to be tricked easily. That humans observed these debates indirectly, piecing together the structure of the Terran leadership and understanding their motives. It became clear that the Terran were desperate, not merely for survival but for political gain, and that they were willing to manipulate both their own people and an entire interstellar species to achieve their goals. The tension reached a personal level for the human operatives as well. They had to navigate conversations with Terran officials, responding politely while probing for inconsistencies. They had to interact with civilians, offering reassurance without revealing their growing suspicion. Every step required subtlety, judgment, and the ability to anticipate multiple moves ahead. Humans were not just observers, they were active participants in a high-stakes game of deception, diplomacy, and potential violence. Their training, instincts, and judgment were being tested in ways that mirrored the survival challenges their species had faced for millennia. They understood the gravity of their role. Any misstep could result in real casualties, political chaos, or the empowerment of deceptive leaders. Amid all this, the human fleet maintained readiness. Ships were positioned strategically, prepared for rapid response if the situation escalated into genuine conflict. Sensors were continuously active, recording anomalies, movement patterns, and potential threats. Humans prepared contingency plans for evacuation, defensive action, or, if necessary, enforcement measures. Every detail was considered, and every potential scenario was mapped. Humans understood that they were walking a fine line, intervene too aggressively, and they could become enforcers for a deceptive cause. Hesitate too long, and real lives could be lost. They had to maintain a balance between moral responsibility and strategic caution, and they did so with remarkable precision. The rising conflict had transformed the simple question of aid into a complex web of intrigue, deception, and subtle power struggles. Humans had uncovered enough evidence to suspect manipulation, but not enough to act decisively without confirming their findings. The Terran, increasingly aware that their ruse might fail, grew more anxious and erratic, creating further opportunities for human observation. Ordinary citizens, caught between leaders' ambitions and the appearance of crisis, added layers of unpredictability. Across the system, the tension was palpable, building toward an inevitable turning point. Humans recognized that the next phase, whether it would result in confrontation, revelation, or intervention, was approaching, and they prepared to act with the same combination of intelligence, caution, and decisiveness that had defined their species for centuries. This rising conflict set the stage for what would become a decisive moment in human-Terran relations. It was no longer a question of observation alone. It was a test of human judgment, insight, and ability to respond appropriately to complex interstellar deception. Every day brought new revelations, new manipulations, and new ethical considerations. Humans were not merely evaluating a potential threat, they were witnessing the unraveling of a carefully constructed illusion. And as the tension grew, so did the realization that the outcome of this conflict would have consequences far beyond the Terran system, affecting perceptions, alliances, and power structures throughout the galaxy. Humanity's patience, intelligence, and strategic thinking were about to be tested like never before, and the rising conflict that had begun with subtle inconsistencies would soon escalate to a breaking point that would reveal the full scope of the Terran's deception and the true nature of the human response. The calm observation and cautious investigation that had defined humanity's early involvement in the Terran crisis were about to end. The situation, which had been tense but manageable, suddenly tipped into a state of undeniable urgency. It began subtly, with small incidents that hinted at deeper deception. Human operatives noticed ships maneuvering in ways inconsistent with defensive protocols. Certain attacks that had seemed accidental now appeared coordinated, almost as if designed to provoke the humans into action. Sensors detected communications being scrambled, locations being misreported, and security protocols being overridden. The humans, trained to detect manipulation, realized that the Terran leadership was escalating the situation deliberately. It was no longer a test of patience or observation, it was a challenge to humanity itself, a calculated attempt to force a response under false pretenses. This escalation reached a critical point when a reconnaissance vessel from the human fleet came under what appeared to be a direct attack. The timing, location, and intensity suggested a serious threat. Alarms blared, sensors recorded incoming fire, and the crew prepared for immediate defensive maneuvers. To an outside observer, it looked like a sudden outbreak of violence. The Terran had effectively created the appearance of aggression against humans, hoping to portray themselves as the helpless victims being targeted by a hostile empire. Civilians in nearby districts screamed and fled, smoke and artificial explosions adding to the illusion of chaos. For the first time, the human operatives had to confront the possibility that they were in a trap, test of their morality, patience, and strategic decision-making. Yet humans were not easily manipulated. They had faced threats far greater than staged attacks and understood that appearances could be deceiving. The crew immediately initiated comprehensive scans, cross-checked weapon signatures, and analyzed trajectories. The results were alarming but telling. The attack had been orchestrated, weapon outputs were inconsistent with the alleged aggressor's known technology, fire patterns suggested intentional staging. Even environmental damage was superficial, failing to match what a real assault would have caused. Humans realized that the Terran were trying to provoke them, to create a scenario in which any intervention would appear justified while actually advancing a manipulative agenda. This recognition marked a turning point. The humans now understood the full scale of the deception and the stakes involved. They were being lured into conflict not to save lives but to serve as instruments of political and territorial gain. The human response was immediate, but measured. They could not allow the Terran to manipulate them, yet they also had to avoid harming civilians in the process. Ships moved into defensive positions, creating a perimeter that protected their reconnaissance teams while signaling readiness for decisive action. Simultaneously, human operatives engaged Terran leadership with firm but controlled communication. They demanded explanations for the discrepancies between reports, evidence, and observations. The Terran attempted to continue their performance, presenting rehearsed narratives and insisting that attacks had occurred. But the humans, armed with data from multiple sources, cyber intelligence, and careful observation, were not swayed. The stage was set for a confrontation in which the humans would assert control over the narrative, exposing deception while preventing unnecessary violence. As tensions escalated, it became clear that this was no longer a localized issue. Communications intercepted from the neighboring empire. The supposed aggressor confirmed that they had not launched any large-scale attacks. Their fleets were engaged in routine patrols, and civilians were unharmed in areas that the Terran had claimed were devastated. That humans now had corroboration from independent sources that the Terran narrative was largely fabricated. This revelation allowed them to shift from cautious observation to a posture of controlled enforcement. They were still careful to avoid unnecessary escalation, but they were prepared to take decisive action if the Terran continued to manipulate the situation. The breaking point came when human intelligence confirmed the ultimate intent behind the deception. The Terran leaders were not merely exaggerating danger, they were attempting to weaponize humanity's reputation for fairness and military prowess. By presenting themselves as victims of aggression, they hoped to provoke humans into intervening militarily against the neighboring empire, thereby securing disputed territories and strengthening their political position. In other words, the Terran were willing to sacrifice human lives to achieve their ambitions. This understanding was profound. Humans realized that they were being used as pawns in a high-stakes political game. Any misstep on their part could trigger real conflict, resulting in unnecessary casualties and destabilization of an entire sector. Upon recognizing the full scope of the deception, the human fleet initiated a series of calculated measures. Cyber teams infiltrated Terran communication networks, uncovering detailed plans of manipulation. Logs, altered messages, and staged attack simulations were documented and cross-referenced. Evidence of coordination between government officials and orchestrated civilian performances emerged. Leaving no doubt about the intent, the humans now had irrefutable proof that the Terran had attempted to provoke a war for their own gain. At the same time, operational teams prepared the fleet for immediate deployment, not as aggressors but as enforcers of truth. The situation demanded both precision and restraint. They needed to assert control, neutralize deception, and protect innocents without escalating to unnecessary violence. As the breaking point reached its climax, the Terran leadership began to panic. Their confidence in humanity's predictable morality faltered. They had expected humans to intervene impulsively, driven by compassion and a desire to prevent suffering. Instead, humans had observed, analyzed, and prepared. The balance of power shifted instantly. The Terran were no longer in control of the narrative. Humans were. Every deception, every staged attack, every attempt at manipulation had been detected. The psychological advantage the Terran had hoped to exploit was lost. The leaders scrambled, attempting to justify their actions, to deflect blame, and to maintain appearances. Yet humans, methodical and relentless in their approach, were already moving toward decisive intervention. In this tense moment, the humans made a choice that would define the outcome of the crisis. They would not act out of anger, impulse, or vengeance. Instead, they activated a plan that combined overwhelming presence with undeniable evidence. Ships moved into strategic positions across the Terran system, creating a visual and tactical display of authority. Communications were broadcast to every major sector, presenting the evidence of deception clearly and without ambiguity. The message was simple: truth would be enforced, manipulation would not be tolerated, and any attempt to weaponize human compassion would fail. The Terran, confronted with both proof and overwhelming human capability, realized that their gamble had failed. Panic spread through their leadership as they understood the consequences of their actions. The civilians, many of whom had been unaware of the full scale of the deception, reacted with shock and confusion. They had been instructed to perform fear and desperation, yet the humans treated them with calm authority, distinguishing between manipulated citizens and the leadership responsible for orchestrating the crisis. Humans provided protection for those genuinely at risk, ensuring that innocent lives were preserved even as deceptive officials were held accountable. The clarity and fairness of this approach underscored humanity's unique combination of compassion and strategic intelligence. It was not merely a display of force, it was a demonstration of moral authority, demonstrating that truth and justice would prevail even in the face of sophisticated manipulation. At the breaking point, it became evident that the Terran's plan had backfired entirely. Instead of securing allies and territorial advantage, they had exposed themselves to the full scrutiny and power of one of the galaxy's most capable species. Their credibility collapsed, both internally and externally. Leaders who had orchestrated the deception were identified and isolated. Communications that had attempted to justify or conceal their actions were documented as evidence. The humans had transformed a potential trap into an opportunity to assert control, enforce truth, and prepare for the next phase of resolution. This moment marked a turning point not only in the Terran crisis but in humanity's interstellar reputation. It demonstrated that humans could detect manipulation, respond with precision, and enforce accountability without unnecessary violence. The breaking point also had broader implications. Neighboring empires, observing the human response, recognized that any attempt to manipulate or deceive them using human intervention would be futile. humanity had demonstrated a unique ability to combine observation, intelligence, ethical judgment, and overwhelming capability. The Terran who had hoped to exploit this reputation instead became a cautionary example. Their actions would be remembered across the galaxy as a failed attempt to use deception as a weapon, and humanity's response would become a benchmark for how crises of trust and manipulation could be managed effectively. In this moment of climax, humans were not just responding to deception, they were defining the rules of engagement for the broader galaxy. They had reached the breaking point where observation and analysis gave way to action, where the measured patience of days turned into decisive enforcement of truth. The Terran crisis, which had begun as a plea for help, had evolved into a profound lesson on ethics, strategy, and the consequences of manipulation. Humans demonstrated that while compassion was a strength, discernment and preparedness were equally vital, ensuring that no plea for help could be misused without consequence. As the dust settled on the breaking point, the human fleet maintained its readiness while the Terran leadership faced accountability. The stage was set for the next phase, resolution. But the breaking point itself, the moment when humans fully recognized the extent of the deception and acted decisively, would remain a defining event. It showcased humanity's capacity to navigate complex crises, to protect innocence, to enforce truth, and to assert authority without unnecessary destruction. It was a moment that combined intelligence, ethics, and overwhelming capability, a moment that solidified humanity's reputation not just as death, but as enforcers of justice and guardians of interstellar truth. After reaching the breaking point, humanity's approach shifted from careful observation to decisive action. The humans had gathered undeniable evidence of the Terran leadership's deception, fabricated attacks, altered communication logs, staged civilian fear, and manipulated intelligence. It was clear that the Terran had attempted to exploit humanity's reputation for fairness and moral judgment to provoke intervention in a conflict that served their political and territorial ambitions. At this stage, the human fleet acted not as rescuers, not as mere observers, but as enforcers of truth and justice. The atmosphere in the system was tense, yet controlled. The humans were deliberate, knowing that every action would ripple across the galaxy and set precedents for how such situations would be handled in the future. The first step was to assert human authority clearly and unmistakably. Ships were repositioned in a formation that was both strategic and symbolic. The fleet's presence was overwhelming, yet there was no initial aggression. Communications were broadcast to every major orbital station, every planetary hub, and directly to Terran leadership. The message was straightforward. Deception had been detected, manipulation would not be tolerated, and consequences would follow unless the situation was resolved immediately. The calm, measured tone of the human announcement contrasted sharply with the panic it generated among the Terran officials. They had expected fear-driven intervention, impulsive responses based on compassion, but this was different. Humans had studied, analyzed, and prepared. They were acting with clarity, precision, and authority. The Terran leadership realized that their previous gambit had failed, and that any further attempts at manipulation would be met with overwhelming and puring immediate consequences. While the Terran leaders scrambled to respond, human intelligence operatives worked tirelessly to secure key information and establish control over communications. All major data channels were intercepted and monitored. Logs were downloaded, decrypted, and compared against sensor readings, creating an irrefutable record of the deception. Meanwhile, the human fleet established controlled zones around major population centers to protect civilians from any potential harm. These zones were patrolled by advanced human security units, whose presence reassured citizens even as the leadership's credibility unraveled. Humans made a deliberate distinction between innocent civilians and those responsible for orchestrating the deception. Every action reflected careful judgment. The goal was not punishment for its own sake, but restoration of truth, protection of innocence, and enforcement of accountability. Simultaneously, humans engaged in direct negotiations with the Terran leadership. The approach was firm but fair. They presented the evidence of staged attacks, falsified records, and manipulated communications in a clear, undeniable manner. Attempts by the Terran officials to deflect blame or continue their narrative were met with data that proved otherwise. The humans' ability to cross-reference multiple independent sources, sensor logs, communications intercepts, environmental scans left no room for argument. The Terran leadership, confronted with irrefutable proof, began to collapse under the weight of their own deceit. Panic, confusion, and desperation became evident as officials realized that their political strategy had failed completely. Every attempt at improvisation or diversion was anticipated by the humans, who maintained calm control over the unfolding scenario during this period. The human fleet also ensured that any actual threats from the neighboring empire were neutralized. Though the empire had not initiated attacks as the Terran claimed, humans recognized the importance of preventing any escalation while the crisis was resolved. The patrol units were dispatched to critical sectors, ready to intervene if needed, while communications with empire leaders were opened to clarify the situation. This dual approach, protecting innocence and maintaining strategic oversight, demonstrated the depth of human preparation and adaptability. Unlike species that might have reacted impulsively, humans combined moral judgment with tactical planning, ensuring that the resolution would minimize harm while restoring order. The breaking of the Terran's narrative had immediate consequences for their population. Ordinary citizens, many of whom had been unaware of the full extent of their leader's deception, reacted with shock and confusion. Propaganda that had been carefully maintained to manipulate perception quickly collapsed under the weight of evidence. Humans engaged directly with the public, explaining the situation in clear, understandable terms. They reassured civilians that their safety was a priority and that the deception had originated from a limited group of leaders, not the population as a whole. This distinction was crucial. Humans understood that maintaining trust with the population would be essential for long-term stability, and their efforts reflected a combination of compassion and strategic foresight. That's evidence continued to be documented, and Terran leaders faced accountability. The human fleet took additional steps to prevent future manipulation. Data archives were secured, communications monitored, and leadership structures temporarily suspended to allow for an orderly transition. Humans coordinated with neutral galactic authorities to ensure that legal and political frameworks were respected, creating a transparent process for judging the actions of the deceptive officials. These measures reflected humanity's broader approach: enforcement of justice, protection of innocence, and restoration of order, all while maintaining credibility and moral authority. The Terran crisis, which had begun as a seemingly straightforward plea for help, was now being resolved in a way that ensured long-term stability and fairness at the same time. Humans documented the lessons learned from the incident. Sensor data, communications logs, and field observations were carefully analyzed and stored. These records would serve multiple purposes: as evidence of the Terran leadership's actions, as a training resource for future human operatives, and as a reference for other species who might attempt similar manipulation. Humanity's response was not just about resolving the immediate crisis, it was about establishing a precedent. The message was clear across the galaxy: attempts to exploit human morality and reputation would be met with decisive, intelligent, and fair action. The resolution of the Terran crisis became an example of how strength, intelligence, and ethical judgment could be combined to achieve lasting outcomes. One of the most striking elements of the resolution was the handling of the Terran leadership. Rather than resorting to immediate destruction or public humiliation, humans employed a carefully calibrated approach. Key officials were detained, questioned, and presented with evidence of their deception. These actions were designed to restore order, demonstrate accountability, and prevent further manipulation. At the same time, humans maintained respect for procedural fairness, ensuring that even deceptive leaders were treated according to interstellar law. This approach reinforced humanity's reputation as a species that combined power with ethics, demonstrating that strength did not require cruelty and that justice could be both firm and principled. The neighboring empire, which had been implicated in the fabricated attacks, but observed the human actions with a mixture of relief and astonishment. They had expected escalation, perhaps even military confrontation, based on the Terran's manipulation. Instead, humans acted with clarity and precision, neutralizing deception while protecting all parties involved. The Empire recognized that humanity's intervention was not motivated by blind compassion or allegiance to one side. It was guided by evidence, analysis, and ethical enforcement. This reinforced the broader galactic understanding that humans could not be manipulated lightly, and that any attempt to do so would carry significant consequences. The Terran system had been stabilized, the deceptive leadership was neutralized, civilians were reassured and protected, and the neighboring empire's concerns were addressed. Humans maintained a visible presence to ensure compliance and prevent resurgence of deceptive tactics. But they did so without unnecessary aggression. The clarity, decisiveness, and fairness of human action left a lasting impression on all observers, solidifying humanity's reputation not just as Deathworlder, but as guardians of truth and enforceable justice. As the dust settled, the human fleet withdrew gradually, leaving behind secure communications channels, clear leadership structures, and documented evidence for interstellar authorities. The resolution was not about punishment for its own sake. It was about restoring balance, protecting innocence, and ensuring that deception could not thrive unchecked. The Terran leadership had been exposed and held accountable. Ordinary citizens were informed and reassured, and the neighboring empire had clarity about the true situation. The humans' careful yet decisive action created stability, prevented war, and set an example for future interstellar crises. Humanity demonstrated the unique combination of traits that had defined their species for millennia: resilience, intelligence, moral clarity, and strategic capability. They had observed, analyzed, and prepared. They had confronted deception decisively, and they had restored order without unnecessary violence. The Terran crisis, which had threatened to manipulate humans into participating in conflict, was resolved in a manner that preserved life, enforced justice, and demonstrated humanity's capacity to act as both enforcers and protectors. The galaxy had learned an important lesson: deception, no matter how carefully constructed, could not succeed against a species as perceptive, disciplined, and morally guided as humanity. The outcome was clear, lasting, and undeniable. Humans had acted decisively, protecting innocence, exposing manipulation, and restoring stability in a complex interstellar situation. The resolution was a triumph not just of power, but of judgment, ethics, and intelligence, a demonstration of what humanity was capable of when confronted with both moral and strategic challenges. The breaking point had been passed, evidence had been enforced, and justice had been administered. Humans had acted as observers, investigators, and ultimately enforcers of truth, showing that even in the most complex and deceptive situations, clarity, preparation, and ethical action could prevail. It was a decisive moment in interstellar history, one that would be remembered as a testament to humanity's ability to navigate the most challenging crises with intelligence, fairness, and unwavering capability. The Terran crisis, which had begun as a desperate plea for help and evolved into a high-stakes interstellar confrontation, finally entered its aftermath. The dust of deception and tension settled slowly across the Terran system. Civilians emerged cautiously from the shadows of fear, while the galaxy at large began to absorb the implications of what had unfolded. Humanity, having revealed the full scope of the Terran leadership's manipulation, stood not only as an enforcer of justice but also as a symbol of moral and strategic authority in a complex galaxy. The consequences of their actions extended far beyond the immediate resolution. The humans' intervention had reshaped relationships, altered perceptions, and provided a lesson in both ethics and power that would resonate for decades. For the ordinary Terran citizen, life began to return to a form of cautious normalcy. Many had been caught in the elaborate web of deception spun by their leaders, forced to participate in staged attacks, and pressured to perform fear and urgency to manipulate human perception. Now, with the humans' presence maintaining order and ensuring accountability, these civilians experienced a mixture of relief, confusion, and even gratitude. Humans interacted directly with the population, explaining the events in clear and comprehensible terms. They distinguished between the leadership responsible for the deception and the citizens who had been coerced or unaware. This distinction was critical, as it helped restore trust and reassured the population that the humans' aim was protection and stability, not indiscriminate punishment. The process of rebuilding trust was slow, requiring patience, consistency, and communication, but the humans approached it with the same methodical discipline they had applied to the investigation and resolution. In the corridors of power, the Terran leadership faced the full weight of accountability. Officials who had orchestrated the deception were detained, interrogated, and held responsible for their actions. Evidence collected by the humans, altered logs, falsified communications, staged attack simulations, and environmental manipulation was presented systematically, leaving no room for evasion or denial. This process was rigorous, fair, and transparent, ensuring that justice was served without bias. The humans made a point of demonstrating that power without ethics would not succeed, setting a precedent for interstellar political conduct. Leaders across neighboring systems took note, understanding that manipulation, deceit, or attempts to exploit human morality would be met with decisive, intelligent, and just action. Beyond the Terran system, the neighboring empire and other galactic observers absorbed lessons from humanity's actions. Many had initially assumed that humans would respond impulsively to pleas for help, as some species often did. Instead, the humans had approached the crisis with caution, intelligence, and ethical rigor, balancing observation, analysis, and decisive enforcement. This behavior reshaped expectations of humanity's capabilities and decisions. Other species now understood that any attempt to manipulate humans would not only fail but could also result in exposure, loss of credibility, and strategic consequences. Humanity had demonstrated that strength without ethics, or intervention without verification, was not their way. Their approach combined compassion, moral clarity, and strategic oversight, leaving a lasting impression on the interstellar political landscape. For the human fleet itself, the aftermath involved reflection and debriefing. Operatives, analysts, and commanders reviewed every step of the operation, noting successes, challenges, and areas for improvement. Detailed reports were compiled, including sensor data, communications, intercepts, civilian interviews, and leadership interactions. These reports served multiple purposes. They documented the resolution of the crisis, provided a training resource for future missions, and created a record of humanity's ethical and strategic response for other galactic authorities. The humans' approach emphasized learning as well as enforcement, ensuring that experience gained from the Terran crisis would inform future operations. The fleet's leadership also evaluated the broader impact of their actions, considering not only immediate outcomes but also long-term implications for interstellar diplomacy, trust, and conflict prevention. The Terran system itself underwent significant structural and societal changes. With deceptive leaders removed or neutralized, a period of reorganization and reform began. Humans provided guidance to establish temporary governance structures, ensure secure communication networks, and facilitate transparent decision-making. These measures aimed to prevent a recurrence of manipulation or abuse of power. Citizens were encouraged to participate in the rebuilding process, providing input, feedback, and oversight. The humans emphasized education and transparency, demonstrating that stability relied on informed populations and accountable leadership. Over time, these reforms helped rebuild societal trust and create a system less vulnerable to deception or manipulation, reinforcing the broader lessons of the crisis. Reflecting on the humans' role, it became clear that their influence had extended far beyond simple intervention. They had set a benchmark for ethical conduct, strategic thinking, and decisive enforcement. They had shown that power without principle was ineffective, that observation and evidence were essential for action, and that even the most sophisticated deceptions could be unraveled through intelligence, patience, and moral clarity. Humans had acted not out of impulse or vengeance, but out of a combination of strategic foresight and ethical responsibility. This approach reinforced their reputation as Deathworlders, a species capable of surviving extreme conditions, assessing threats with unparalleled acuity, and acting decisively when justice and morality demanded it. The aftermath also provided an opportunity for interstellar reflection. Across the galaxy, species began to reassess their assumptions about crises, deception, and intervention. The Terran crisis served as a case study in manipulation, illustrating how even the most sophisticated schemes could fail when confronted with intelligence, ethical rigor, and strategic capability. Humanity's approach demonstrated that intervention did not have to be destructive, that power could be exercised responsibly, and that truth and fairness could prevail even in complex, high-stakes situations. These lessons were disseminated through diplomatic channels, interstellar councils, and academic institutions, ensuring that the knowledge gained would benefit not only humans but other species navigating similar challenges. For the humans themselves, the aftermath was also a time for introspection. Operatives and commanders considered the ethical dilemmas they had faced, the challenges of distinguishing between deception and genuine risk, and the responsibility that came with their unique capabilities. They reflected on the tension between compassion and strategy, observing how they had balanced moral responsibility with tactical enforcement. These reflections reinforced humanity's core principles: patience, observation, intelligence, ethical clarity, and the willingness to act decisively when circumstances demanded. Each operative carried the lessons forward, understanding that the galaxy would continue to present situations where judgment, ethics, and capability would be tested. The Terran crisis, now fully resolved, left a lasting imprint on interstellar relations. Other species recognized that the humans were a force to be respected not only for their strength but for their ethical and strategic approach. Attempts at manipulation, deceit, or exploitation of human morality would be met with thorough investigation, evidence-based enforcement, and protective measures for innocence. Trust could be earned, but it could not be assumed or exploited. Humanity had established a standard. Intervention required verification, observation, and an unwavering commitment to justice. This standard would shape interstellar diplomacy, trade relations, and political alliances for generations. Even as humans prepared to depart the Terran system, their presence continued to reassure citizens in neighboring species. Security measures remained in place, communication networks were monitored, and leadership structures were reinforced. Humans had ensured that the resolution was sustainable, that the lessons of the crisis were embedded in societal structures, and that the potential for recurrence of manipulation was minimized. Their careful withdrawal demonstrated confidence, foresight, and strategic planning, leaving a system that was secure, stable, and aware of the consequences of deception. The reflection on the entire Terran crisis emphasized a profound truth: complexity, manipulation, and high stakes were intrinsic to interstellar relations, but intelligence, ethics, and strategic foresight could overcome them. Humans had navigated the crisis from initial observation, through rising tension and confrontation, to resolution and aftermath. Combining patience, analytical rigor, and moral clarity at every stage, they had preserved life, enforced justice, exposed deception, and set precedents that would influence galactic interactions for decades. The Terran crisis became a story not merely of intervention, but of the unique qualities that defined humanity: resilience, insight, ethical judgment, and the ability to act decisively in the face of both moral and strategic challenges. Ultimately, the aftermath of the Terran crisis was a testament to humanity's approach to complex interstellar situations. Civilians were protected, leadership was held accountable, neighboring empires were reassured, and the galaxy witnessed a display of intelligence, ethics, and power that left a lasting impression. Humans had resolved the crisis not through brute force alone, but through the combination of careful observation, evidence gathering, ethical enforcement, and strategic presence. The outcome was stable, just, and instructive, reflecting the depth of preparation, intelligence, and moral clarity that characterized humanity. The lessons learned would continue to shape interstellar relations, providing guidance for future crises and reinforcing the understanding that deception, no matter how elaborate, could not succeed against a species as capable and principled as humanity. Humanity's handling of the Terran crisis inspired dialogue and collaboration across the galaxy. Councils, academies, and interstellar alliances studied the events, seeking to understand the human methodology. Questions of ethics, evidence, strategy, and responsibility were debated and recorded. Humanity's ability to integrate intelligence with morality became a model, demonstrating that a species could be both powerful and principled. The Terran crisis, once a test of perception and patience, had become a lesson for all. Clarity, preparation, and ethical action were inseparable from true capability. In the final assessment, the humans' actions in the aftermath were marked by foresight, balance, and enduring impact. They had preserved life, restored order, enforced accountability, and set a precedent for interstellar conduct. Civilians were safe, leadership structures were reformed, and political relations across the galaxy were clarified. Humanity had transformed a potentially disastrous situation into a demonstration of intelligence, ethics, and authority. The Terran crisis would be remembered not just as a story of deception and intervention, but as a testament to the qualities that defined humanity: the ability to see beyond appearances, act decisively, protect the innocent, and enforce justice in even the most complex and high-stakes scenarios.